right, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. I have a special episode for you today. I'm titling this episode, What's Happened to Women's Rights? My guest today is Inga Thompson, one of the most decorated cyclists in American history. She competed at the 1984, 1988, and 1992 Olympic Games with the best result of 8th place in 1988. I saw her compete in the 1984 Olympics, standing on the side of the road in Orange County, California, as she chased Connie Carpenter and Rebecca Twigg, two of the greatest cyclists in the world at that time. I'll never forget her signature long ponytail whipping about as she sprinted her bike, taking 21st place in an international field not that long after she had entered the sport. Inga won silver medals at the World Championships in 1987, 1990, and 1991, and placed third at the Tour de France, 1986 and 1989. She also won the U.S. National Road Race Championships in 87, 88, 90, 91, 93. And in 2014, she was inducted into the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame and has since worked to advance women in sports, and as such serves on many advocacy groups and has her own Inga Thompson Foundation, ingathompsonfoundation.org, that advocates for women's sports. So, you might be asking, besides being aware that I'm something of a bike geek, why am I having on a cyclist on this show? Well, we're not here to talk about carbon fiber frames, electronic shifting, training diets, or why the word suffering seems to appear whenever you're describing our sport. In fact, we're not even here to review a generic history of women's women's rights, starting with the suffrage movement in the early 20th century, or the Equal Rights Amendment movement of the 1970s, or the difference between the second and third wave feminism, although we can get into that later if we want. I wrote about all that in my 2015 book, The Moral Arc. Now, we're here to talk about what happened to Inga when she spoke out in defense of women's rights. Not against bible-thumping religious fundamentalists who think women belong in the kitchen and bedroom making dinner and babies, but against her fellow liberals who astonishingly today seem to think it's perfectly reasonable for biological males to compete against and defeat biological females in sports. In 2019, Inga obtained the signatures of over 80 Olympians on a petition to the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to limit women's categories to cisgender women, with many other women such as swimmers Riley Gaines, Nancy Hogshead Makar, and Sharon Davis, tennis star Martina Navratilova, and fellow cyclist Alison Sidor. Thompson advocates for categories in sports separated by sex. Okay, let that sink in. After a century of fighting for the right to vote, the right to obtain a mortgage without a husband, the right to work and be treated equally under the law, and after half a century of enjoying under Title IX and other legal protections the right to compete against other women in their own division of sports, it now requires a document signed by women, sent to men, demanding that these hard-earned rights be maintained. And no, Inga Thompson is not a transphobe. In fact, although opposing participation of transgender women in women's cycling events and sports in general, she's also advocated for a separate transgender category, and I agree with that. You would think liberals of all people would see in this a practical solution, but no. Instead, this document prompted an outcry from members of the Oregon Bicycling Racing Association who called for her removal from the organization's board of directors as they said her statements did not align with the policies of the organization. Oh, really? And what would those policies be? That it's okay for biological males to compete against and trounce women in sports? Okay, how's that for a rant for you? But that's how I feel. Inga, thanks for listening to that, for your patience, and thanks for coming on the show. Tell me, what in the world has happened in the last 5 years?
I think you kind of summed it up fairly well. You don't need to interview me now. What has happened? Boy, what rabbit hole to go down. Do you want to start with back when it was John Money trying to prove his theory?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, sure. If you know all that, yeah, please start there.
Yeah, you could start there with John Money trying to prove his theory that sex is it's a social construct. And he went out to prove his theory of it being a social construct and that it wasn't male and female and it had nothing to do with XX and XY. And so the perfect scenario came along when there was this family called the Reimers, and I hope I get that correct, very, very young couple. I think they were like 20 and 21, and they had twins. And they took their twins in to be circumcised because they were having problems with urination, and they felt like the circumcision would help that. And so the first child, whose name was Bruce, who went on to become Brenda, and I think after that he became David. But so Bruce was the first, and they had some electric cautery thing to do the circumcision, and the equipment failed, and it fried his penis. So the second child was not circumcised. And so now you have this young couple that has, a child with no penis, didn't know what to do. And they saw John Money promoting this, sex is a social construct. And so they went to him, and this man is highly regarded in the circles that he's in. And he convinces them to take Bruce and make him Brenda, and said, don't ever, ever, ever tell Bruce or Brenda that they are in fact male. And so Money promotes this as a huge success, when in fact behind the scenes it is not a success. And so from there, so Jordan Peterson did a great interview with a woman on this just recently, I think a few weeks ago. So if you want more depth on that, definitely look at the Jordan Peterson thing. But they talk about how Bruce, now Brenda, was quite aggressive. They called her cave woman, and eventually Bruce gets the truth. He ends up marrying a woman, adopting some children, and then eventually commits suicide. So when he finally speaks out, he talks about how much he had struggled with this, whereas all of the journals were with Money were putting out that this is a huge success, and it never was. And so that was the slow start rollout, and that happened in the 60s. And so so by the time that Bruce or Brenda hits their 20s, they're already struggling with their sexuality. And the way that I relate with this was about the same. These two boys, young men now, where both of them have since committed suicide, are about my age. And so in about 1996, the Olympic Committee went to all of the Olympians and they said, are you comfortable doing the gender verification test, which was nothing more than a cotton swab to the inside of our mouths, and you picked up some DNA. And if you were XX, you got to compete in the women's category. And it was such a simple test. There was no gynecological exam. It was just XX. And that also helped weed out anybody who was 46XY. So it took out your men. And it also took out 46XY DSD, which is differentiations in sexual development. I hope I got that right. And so it took out people like Castor Semina that you speak about. Like Castor is not a woman that lacks a uterus. Castor Semina is a man with internal gonads, but lacks. When he was born, he presented as a woman and was raised as a woman, but then as puberty hits, if you look at Castor Semina, they are married to a woman. They present as a man in private life, but yet was raised as a woman. And so now you have so after 1996, when they stopped having the cotton swab test for the XX, it opened the door to people like Castor Semina. And then you start hitting about 2000 teens. I want to say 15. Don't quote me on that one. Before that, if you wanted to go in there as a man, they also allowed transsexuals to come in, which you had to go through the full operation before they would allow you in. And then about 2015, here comes Kristen Worley stating that they were reading the IOC rules and regulations and they have gender dysphoria and thought, hey, if I castrate myself and go through this operation, I can race with the women. And in the process of doing that, started to run into some serious health complications because the male body is meant to have testosterone. So they started having a lot of health issues. And then from there, they went through a tribunal with Canada and the IOC, and they were allowed to have a therapeutic use exemption to still compete as a woman, but able to take testosterone for health reasons, which is kind of interesting because a woman can have a hysterectomy and or go through menopause, and they can't get a therapeutic use exemption to have better health. And we're not talking about getting up to men's levels. I mean, women can be up to 2 nanomoles per liter. I think I raised it maybe 0.6 nanomoles per liter. But, I take DHEA, which is like a precursor to testosterone, to bring myself up to healthy levels as a postmenopausal woman. But it also means that I can never race my bike. So I have to choose between health and being able to race. And I choose to have a healthy body. But it also takes me out of competition. But when you look at it, the men can take a therapeutic use exemption and still compete with the women, but the women can't. I mean, it just make it make sense. You can't make it make sense. So you have this slow roll forward from, starting with John Money and the Reimer twins, and the International Olympic Committee allowing to stop having the gender testing, and then you get into Martine Rothenblatt, who is mega billionaire that transitioned at an older age and then started really funding the whole movement for transgender people. And so what I will say about this is that I think that there truly are some transgender people, but it's very, very rare. But when you start getting into self-ID, you open up the Pandora box for men with autogynephilia to self-ID as a woman, and then step into women's sports. And what you usually see is with true transgender people, I can't say enough good things about them, and how many transgender people that I know, and even they would say that this movement is not good for them because it has opened up the door for the autogynephilia, AGP, which is the sexual fetishization of dressing like a woman, and then to validate that, they want everybody around them to validate that they are indeed a woman. But this gender dysphoria that demands that we validate them is where you start getting into the issues of, okay, I want to be validated and I want to be in women's sports. And that's part of the validation process and the mental gymnastics that you have to go through to get to believe that it is actually fair for them to get into women's sports, considering that there's, last count, 22 peer-reviewed studies that show no amount of testosterone suppression mitigates the advantages of being born male. And even after 14 years of testosterone suppression, they still retain that advantage. And so, like, when you look at the world anti-doping regulations, if you test positive for testosterone, and I believe, I can't remember if it's the first time or the second time, you are banned for life. And the reason why is, like, say, as a woman or a man, if I'm competing here, right, and I start taking testosterone, and I'm able to train up here, and then I get caught or banned or whatever, or I stop taking testosterone, then I come down to here, and I am now at a level that I never could have gotten before because I was training up here with testosterone. And so this is why when you get caught taking testosterone, you have a ban for life because you still retain that advantage of being here. You will always retain that advantage. And that's with a woman and or a man. I'm going to say with the women. So now you have a man that has gone through male puberty and they've been up here for their whole life. Yes, when you put them on testosterone suppression, their level will come down. But it's going to come down to here. And so they retain a 10 to 30% advantage over women depending on the sport. Is it a power sport, endurance sport? So this is where cycling gets interesting because it's endurance. So maybe there's a 10% advantage, but then you get into the jumps and the attacks, and that's power. That's just raw power. I know when I raced with the men, if it was just head down going really hard, I could suck it up and I could stand there. But as soon as there was a big jump and a sprint, I'm like, poof, and hopefully get onto some train behind that and get myself back up there. But I raced with the men all the time, and I was arguably always top 3 in the world as a woman, and I raced with the men, and I never would have made the national team. You could have put me on all the steroids in the world, and I never would have made the men's national team. It just wasn't going to happen. I know what I could do, and I'm very well aware of the fact of what I couldn't do. And so there's no even giving women testosterone and taking a man and removing their testosterone will level the playing field. It just can't happen because women, we are not small, weaker men. We are women.
Perfectly said. Just a point of clarification on that. That's post-puberty, everything you're talking about there, I believe. So what if somebody transitioned at age 3 or 4 or whatever, and then at age 15, 16, 20 or whatever started entering women's sports? Would that be different?
It's different, and yet it's not, because the XY chromosome fetus goes through a small amount of testosterone surges in the womb. And then through growth, they go through these surges in the womb. And just having that Y chromosome, even without the testosterone, you're still going to have bigger bones. You're still going to have a bigger heart. So you're going to have the ability to move more blood. Your mitochondria, which is your part of your fuel reserves, men use that differently, more efficiently. So just having that Y chromosome in there, it makes a difference. And I would let you talk to somebody else that could really clearly explain that, because I will just slaughter it.
Well, here I would recommend Helen Joyce's book Trans, because she's not politicized and conservative in that sense, like, say, Abigail Schreier is a bit, and Jordan also very controversial. The whole issue has become politicized. Also, to your first story you talked about with John Money, I'd point listeners to Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate. He has a long discussion of this. Steve is not politicized at all. It's just a kind of a long history, like you just did, but even longer, of this trend toward a blank slateism about human nature, probably because of a pushback against Nazi eugenics and the whole, even before the Nazis, American eugenicists, which were on the left. Those were liberals at the time in the early 1900s who were pushing for this. And so all the bad things that happened to that, all the sterilization of American citizens often without their knowledge or consent, even endorsed by the U.S. Supreme Court, had dire ramifications. So you could sort of see why that movement happened in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights and women's rights movement. It's like, hey, we don't want to go down this rabbit hole of the Nazi eugenics. Look what happened. So we're going to go the other direction.
I'm going to have to read this one. I know over my lifetime I have read everything on the sterilization and the frontal lobotomies and the Nazi things. But this is a book I have to read where it sounds like it sums it up. That'll be next on my reading list.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're talking about here, back to, what is a woman? So you talked about, chromosomes, yes, but it's also what those program for. That is to say, what kind of gametes you make. Small gametes like sperm or large gametes like eggs. But as Helen Joyce points out in her book Trans, you got to look under the hood. There's 10,000 little changes that happen throughout the lifetime. As you just said, even in the womb, there's differences that those XXXY chromosomes program for to happen. So again, it's not like you can just bolt on some breast implants and put on some lipstick and you're a woman. I mean, it's just, there's, a 10,000, 100,000 changes throughout the lifetime under the hood, as Helen Joyce puts it. And so what we end up with is kind of discussing these edge cases. Well, what about the XXY or the XYY, or the case of some of the examples you gave? Those are real. So what do you do with those? When you have a binary system, there's men's sports, women's sports, and so on. How do you think about those edge cases?
You hear it argued all the time where, say, the edge cases, is it fair for Michael Phelps to be there because he has a biological advantage? Well, in the male category, he does. So that we have a lot of false equivalencies going on there. If you listen to Emma Hilton, who's an evolutionary biologist, she will just take that one apart. But the edge cases that we're looking at are you talking Castor Semina? That is a 46. Well, is XY and has internal gonads, and so they are getting testosterone in there, and you can see that in their development. Castor Semina won everything against the woman, so that edge case. I think they had 3 women on the or 3 46 XYDSD women on the podium during the Olympics, which drove Sebastian Coe and World Athletics to somehow try to implement some type of policy in there to protect the woman. But what we're really coming down to is, even with these edge cases, they're still showing that it's not fair to the women. You have to have the same competitor in the same classification for the same competitor. So what's a good way to describe this one? So we have classes for a reason to have fairness. And then within those classes, we have categories to keep having fairness. So you have men, you have women, you have para, you have weight, you have age. I mean, there's all sorts of categories to keep this fair. And then within that, you have now, like, say, okay, so we have men who are in their 20s and who are competing. But even with that, then we have pro, and we have category 1, and we have category 2, and category 3, and category 5. So we have another breakdown in there. So I just don't understand why it can't be as simple as we will have a transgender category. And within the transgender category, you can have, when did they transition? How long have they been transitioning? Did they do it before puberty, after puberty? This is for them to figure out how to do this. The same way that when you have para, you have, what type of physical disability do you have? And they have, systems within there. So I would say within the transgender athletes, they would know best how to put themselves into these different categories, have what stage of transition that they are at. What you cannot argue is that they should be in the women's category. They need to be in their own category. And so, and let's look at it from yet another perspective. The World Anti-Doping Agency says, it's all about keeping drugs out of our system, right? So now we're going to take a transgender woman and we're going to ask them to take drugs in order to qualify for a classification that they never should have been in. They never should have been in the women's category. So we're going to promote taking a whole bunch of drugs to get into the women's category. And now you're advocating for, we know how unhealthy it is to take all of these drugs. So you can be advocating for them taking their drugs to have a compromised body in order to qualify for a classification that they should never be in. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, because where does it stop? If I could qualify for the 10-year-old category by taking drugs, should I do that? Should I go up against the 10-year-olds and not give them the chance for a fair opportunity to figure out how good they can be? Because I just decided that I identify as a 10-year-old, and I'm kind of thinking right now at the age of 60 that the 10-year-old would still kind of kick my butt. But what would it take for me to identify as a 10-year-old, which I honestly do a lot of times, I feel, and to be in there. But what type of mental gymnastics do you have to do for me to actually think that that might be really fair for me and it would be fair for them? So now, so why are men with gender dysphoria who really think that this would be fair, and the mental gymnastics they have to go through to think that it would be fair if I got into the women, and then I want everybody to applaud for me being in this classification? I mean, it just doesn't even make sense to me that we now all have to affirm that they think is fair when we all know that it's not fair, but we all have to clap and pretend like, yeah, you fairly won that event, when we all clearly know that they didn't. I mean, it's the distortion of reality here is off the scale. So we didn't, 20 years ago, the idea of men being in a women's category would just make us roll our eyeballs. But what's the next step? And we start seeing this, like, now you're seeing, back to this AGP, taking it a step further, we have full men who identify as babies, and we have host families that will take care of these men who identify as babies. So you already see this age thing those boundaries being pushed. So my joke about getting into the 10-year-old category, which you think and I think is ludicrous, isn't that far away.
I was not aware of this. There's adults identifying as babies.
Yes. And they have host families that take care of them. I'll send you a few links. But that is out there. And right now we would say, well, they will never try to identify into the 10-year-old category. Well, I never thought a man would identify into the women's category. And here we are. So where does it end?
Unbelievable. Inga, you stood on a lot of podiums. What do you imagine goes through the mind of someone like a Leah Thomas who gets up on the podium and has to, on some level, know that this is just not right? Or are they just so self-deluded that they really feel this is fair? And I mean, you mentioned mental gymnastics. Yeah, that's an understatement.
The mental gymnastics that they go through to believe that they're a woman, and to believe that this is fair to women, and to think that they actually honestly earned that title, there's a fair amount of, what are you going to call it, narcissism, mental delusion, the gender dysphoria. I don't even want to call it gender dysphoria at this part, because the people that I know that are true transgenders, they know that it's not fair. And they say, I will never step into women's sports because it's not fair. I know I have gender dysphoria, but I'm aware of the fact that I'm in a male body. And they live their lives quietly. And like I said, they're great people. And even they laugh about, they know that they're male. And they live with that. And they know they have gender dysphoria. So you have a Leah Thomas that really truly thinks that they deserve to be on the women's podium. Even the true transgender people don't believe that. So then could you go to massive narcissism, massive entitlement, that I am entitled? What leads a man to think that they are entitled enough to take that position and think that they really deserve it? I'd love you to have Jordan Peterson on here next, but he addresses this in his interview with Riley Gaines, and he says stuff that I'm not brave enough to say, but I did.
Well, I heard that one. Well, the mental gymnastics. Okay, so here I invoke Robert Trivers' theory of deception and self-deception. Robert Trivers is one of the great evolutionary theorists of our time, and he wrote a book about this on, that we all have a kind of a self-image of a certain kind that you portray to others, but then there's one that you have in your own self. Now, if you're going to deceive others, they may be able to pick up on cues that you're bullshitting them. And so if you believe the lie, then you're less likely to give off the tells that other people will pick up on. So he has this theory about kind of a co-evolution or an evolutionary arms race between deception uh, between deception and deception detection, and then self-deception as a way to get over the deception detection devices in other people. If you believe the lie, you're living it, right? So like cult leaders, they probably actually believe the bullshit they spill out to their followers, who shower them with praise, and they think, well, maybe I am this godlike figure. Then they come to believe it themselves, and then they're even better at selling what it is they're pitching to their audience. So it could be whatever is going on in Leah Thomas's mind, that over the years she's just talked herself into really believing this and doesn't listen to critics or counter arguments like you're making, something like that.
Yeah, well, when I was a child, I was a horse. And I was convinced I was a horse. And I galloped around everywhere on my hands and knees. I mean, for years, I was a horse. And I demanded of my mother that she would feed me on the ground. And thankfully, my mom had some common sense where it was like, that's great. Stand up, sit at the table, and you're going to be a young lady. And, there was a lot of common sense there. Let me live my fantasy. This went on for years. And then I'm pretty sure that I converted my sister to being a horse. And my poor dad, he had a condo that was an upstairs condo. There was a lot of complaining about the horses running around upstairs. But, children get to have those fantasies. And also in my fantasies, I was a boy. Not because I really thought that I was a boy, but because I wanted everything that boys got to have. Because when I was growing up, before Title IX, we didn't get to have sports, and I cut hair, and you can't do that. Only boys do that. And I so badly wanted to be a boy after I couldn't be a horse anymore. But I'm a child at this point. And I also want the advantages that men have, or not the advantages, but I wanted those equal opportunities. And here comes Title IX. And I was able to get into sports because of Title IX. I mean, I had my mom here over Mother's Day, and she talked about being at Lewis and Clark and ski racing. And there was no women's team. So she'd hop in with the men, but ultimately it came down to, you can hop in the men's race here and there, but when the real racing starts, she's not going to be competitive, but that's okay because there's no women's event anyway. And she's of that generation that never had those opportunities. And she had to let me know growing up that, no, you won't have those opportunities either. It's just kind of part of the reality of being a woman. And so anyway, so here comes Title IX, and we now have these opportunities because women fought for these rights. I mean, let's look back, to I have the right to vote. I have the right to have a credit card. I now have the right to own property. These are things that have happened just, at least having a credit card and, other things have happened even within my generation, and the right to have sports. And we're watching all of that being taken away. I mean, some things won't be taken away, like credit card and right to vote, but the sex-separated spaces are very, very important, especially like the one topic that doesn't really get covered is we always hear about the transgender woman and how difficult it is, and their journey is difficult. I agree with that. Their journey is one that I will never, ever understand, the gender dysphoria of the difficulty of their journey. But we have a journey that they will never understand. What happens with a girl that they're still constantly told that you can't, you're a girl, you'll never have that power. The things that we go through as we start to develop and we have a period, and all of the shaming that still goes around that, we all know that. And then the way that they get sexualized as they grow up, as they develop breasts, and women are subjected to, female genital mutilization, and women are subjected to child marriage and just everything that a woman goes through. These men will never, ever, ever understand, as I will never understand what a man goes through when they have to deal with the testosterone surges, and look what men go through. They are expected to give up their life in war. They get divorced. They're expected to give up their children. Men go through a gauntlet that women will never understand. We're all like, oh yeah, hey, you're stronger. Off to war with you and go give up your life. Women don't get that shoved down our throats. But then what happens to us as we grow and evolve? This is back to how separate we are. So when a transgender woman says they are a woman, I'm going to say, no, you're a transgender, you're a man with gender dysphoria, and you're now a transgender woman, and that is a journey that is unique unto you, and that I will never understand, and they need to be respected as such, of what a difficult journey it is. But you just don't get to pop over into the woman's category and think that your journey is the same as ours. Our spaces need to be respected.
Yeah. I don't know if you've read any of Andrew Sullivan's writings. He's a gay commentator, for his whole life. And he at some point, I think his late 20s, he had low testosterone. So he got, some T shots. And then he wrote about what it was like. And he said, oh my God, I had no idea what I was missing. Now I walk around thinking about sex like every 10 minutes. And, I bump into some guy and I just want to say, dude, you want to take it outside and settle this? And he's like, what is happening to me? It's like, yeah, there you go. But he also makes the point that with the current movement, if he would have been 13 and told his counselors at school or his friends or teachers or whatever, I think I'm attracted to boys, not girls, that maybe he would have been told, oh, well, actually, you're in the wrong body. You're not gay. You're straight. You're just, you just need to change sexes, and so, and the opposite of that, what if, like you said, you were identified as a boy after being a horse, but did you mean you were something of a tomboy, and might tomboys be leaning toward being lesbian, but now they're being told actually they're not lesbian, they're straight, but in the wrong body, something like that?
This is a really good one. Had I been born in this day and age, they probably would have transed me, because I still, at that age, I loved tractors. And I loved horses, and I loved motorcycles. I rode motorcycles everywhere. At the age of 8, I started operating little 9N Ford, and we put up the hay loose. I was really, really good at it. I was always in auto shop classes and mechanic classes, and I was a tomboy. I've never had any gay stuff, but I have a ton of gay women friends. But I'm just like your normal, generic white woman, but I'm a tomboy, and I'm still a tomboy. So you can take the gender dysphoria, take out sexuality, gay, not gay, it doesn't really matter. It's a dysphoria of your body. And this is why you see the LGB saying, we have nothing to do with the T, because LGB is about your sexual orientation, and T is about gender dysphoria, because a lot of people who have gender dysphoria don't change their sexual preference in the sense of if a man likes women and then he has gender dysphoria and becomes a woman, he still wants to be sexual with women. So you don't change your preference. Does that make sense? And
yeah. I think people get confused about this. Who you are attracted to is different from who you identify as. And I think there a lot of the confusion happens. We finally went through with a successful gay rights, same-sex marriage rights revolution, the fastest in history. In 2011, both Obama and Hillary were publicly against same-sex marriage. By 2015, it was the law of the land. Now, even conservatives mostly don't even talk about this. And so that happened pretty quick. So one sense I have is that the current trans movement, supported by liberals, is like, well, this is the next thing. We're supposed to be, tolerant and supportive of people that have been oppressed or whatever in a minority position. So we should just jump on board this one. But it feels differently to me than the previous ones.
The reasons why I feel like it's different, like, gay rights, gay marriage, same-sex marriage, I am all in support of. And when I started this journey 5 years ago, I was all in support of transgenders being in women's spaces. And through this process, I have changed my stance on that because it opens the door to the autogynephilia, using this as a loophole. Like you don't see gay people using it as a loophole to invade anybody's spaces. They're truly just living their lives, and they have full acceptance of us. And then the true transgender people, they are living their lives, but they also understand, their gender dysphoria. But it opens up the loophole to the autogynephilia that want to get in there and have everybody around them validate their existence. And the problem with this, the validation of their existence, is when you have a fully intact male in front of young girls, women, and children, you are now violating those women and children spaces. So, back then, if a fully intact male had gotten into the locker room, he would have been arrested. And now a fully intact male is in the locker room, and we are told to be quiet, and we have to accept a girl dick in front of us, and we're the bigots. And this is where it has gone wrong, is that this loophole to allow men to validate their gender dysphoria amongst young children. This is where it's gone wrong. There has to be some respect of the women's spaces, and what went from they just want to pee to complete violation of women's spaces. Like the gay movement never violated anybody's spaces, but to ask young girls to accept a fully intact male there, and you have to accept them, this erodes the young girl's ability to say no to men. And they need to be able to say no. When you have a young girl that, say, just starts menstruating, they need to have that ability to have privacy and not have a male in there with them. And one of the violations of this is like, I was reading this one woman thing where they had a gender neutral toilet. And so she was in there on her period. You can hear the unwrapping of the packages, right? And there was men in there, and she got into the boardroom and overheard the comment of, "Oh yeah, so-and-so, she's on the rag today. So therefore, anything she says today, we're going to have to discount because she's on her period." And so now you have this violation of she can't go in there and be on her period without getting into the boardroom and having that held against her. So there has to be this protection of women's spaces because we are different.
Yeah, somebody sent a link about a frisbee golf. I had no idea it was a big professional thing now, but apparently it's pretty big. And there was a story of a man who entered the women's division in this. So I posted about that on Twitter, and then a professional disc golf player wrote me and said, actually, there's two divisions. It's not men and women. It's women and then open. Anybody could enter. So that's where the trans players should go. And this trans player knew this, but still wanted to enter the women's division anyway. It seems like, why? Because it's easier to win against the men? I don't know. Again, you have that mental gymnastics thing. So what you're proposing, yes, there should be, gender neutral bathrooms, I guess, or 3 bathrooms instead of 2, or multiple divisions. And at some point, I guess it becomes somewhat logistical and expensive. Let's say a corporate building has to have a whole new set of bathrooms that are expensive to build, or something like that. Or maybe you just have the open one. Women can go in women's only, but they can also go in the open one, and trans can go there. Anybody could go in that one.
Right. There's options there. If building new bathrooms is difficult, but we also heard this argument way back when only men had a toilet and women didn't have toilets, and they called it the urinary leash. But toilets Yeah, they
That's
did.
funny.
I mean, this is how they kept women at home. If there was nowhere for them to go to the bathroom, they didn't leave their house. Um, but changes were made, and this is part of the evolution of like, okay, so now we've heard this argument. It's too expensive to get women's toilets out there, but now there are women's toilets. It's we don't have the funding and the money to have a women's category in a race. There's not enough women. Well, you call it build it and they will come. When I raced, I can't tell you how many times I was the only woman on the starting line. And that's what got me racing with the men, is I would hop over and race with the men, but build it and you will come. Look at women's sports now. Women's sports is getting the recognition that it deserves, and women are coming out in hordes to be there. Now what we're also starting to see is that a lot of these women are like, why bother? Studies show that at the age of about 8 to 10, if women aren't given a sex-separated sport, a lot of these young girls are walking away because it's not fair. So this movement is destroying women's sports at the grassroots level. They think it's just elite, and it's not. These young girls are walking away. I mean, I never liked contact sports. And that's why I was always like cross country, or I got into volleyball, and that was too overwhelming for me because there was too much body slamming. But if you want to have the grassroots for sports, you have to give the women the sex-separated spaces, and they can do that. And if they really believe in the women that really want to compete with the men, great, go compete with the men. Go do co-ed. Go have that category as well, to do whatever category classifications. But the one for the women needs to be held just for the women. And that needs to be honored. And so you can do the open category, or you can do a neutral category. However they decide to want to do it, I don't care. But keep the women's category for just the women, so that you are not destroying the grassroots. And the women that want that category can be there, but don't want to compete with the men. And in this day and age of, like, I mean, I could go back to, like, handicap and stuff like that. Handicap people couldn't get over curbs, and they couldn't get into buildings and such. And so when you get these laws implemented, now we have handicap crossings everywhere, and buildings come into compliance. It's possible. If they could put in bathrooms for women and ramps for the handicap, they can make accommodations that are good for transgender people, but still honor women. And that's progress. But progress isn't putting transgender women in women's spaces at the demise or at the exclusion of women. That's not progress. Progress is developing classifications and categories for the transgender women. That's progress.
Yeah. By the way, do you happen to know why in women's professional tennis versus men, they finally have equal pay, but in the Grand Slams, Wimbledon, the French Open, and so forth, the men have to play 3 out of 5 sets, and the women play still 2 out of 3, like the men do in all the other tournaments. And I always wonder why that is, because the women are out there training 5-6 hours a day anyway. It's not like they can't do 3 out of 5 sets. It's just too hard. Or maybe more something you might know more about. Why in women's races, the road races in particular, they're shorter than the men. Why? You women train just as much. You're out there 5-6 hours. It's not like you can't do it. What's the reason for that?
I think it's just old rules and that have always been there. When I first started running, they were absolutely convinced our uteruses would fall out. Last I checked, that hasn't happened yet. And that women can't. And anymore now, like, I used to want to advocate for the women's distances to be as long as the men's, and I'm going to backtrack on that one, because the women's racing I find to be more exciting because our races are shorter and we are out of the gate racing. More attacks, more, you don't have to sit in front of the TV for 5 hours with the men. The women's races are about 2 to 3 hours. And so I personally find myself bored stiff watching the men race. I'll go catch the highlights. But with the women's racing, I want to watch it from beginning to end because they go hard in the international races. Yes, the women can do the distance, even though the International Olympic Committee or ICU Union Cyclists International, they think that we can't. But there's a lot of misogyny in cycling. Like even in 1990, I remember going head to head with Hein Verbruggen about. He wanted to implement that when we were menstruating, that we couldn't race.
What?
and the conversation kind of went like this with him. As I said,
Wait, so just so listeners know, he's the head of the Union Cycliste International.
Exactly. Yeah, he was president at the time, and the coach at the time came up and said, "Hey, they're trying to pass this rule that when you're menstruating, you can't race." And I. This was at the World Championships, and I found Hein, and I'm like, "So you're gonna, try to pass this?" And he goes, "Yeah, at the next management committee meeting, we're going to be discussing not allowing women to race when this was happening." I'm like, "So let's really get down to brass tacks with this. Are you going to start regulating our cycles? Because we're all going to lie, right? We're going to shift up our cycle." And I'm like, "So does that mean you're going to do panty check right before the race?" I'm like, "And if you start doing panty check, they have tampons. So you're going to do string check." I mean, I got this literal with him. And I'm like, that we're going to lie. How are you going to regulate this? I said, women don't train 365 days out of the year through our periods, train our hearts out, and then get to the race and go, "Oh, Aunt Flo is here. I just can't race." No, we've been training through this. We've been racing through this our whole lives. We know how to manage this, but suddenly you're worried about us being on our period during during the race. Are you going to start saying that we can't train during our periods? I mean, where does this end? And I think that I made a good enough argument at that point that it wasn't even presented at the management committee meeting, from what I understand. Because I said, if you're still going to present this, I will be there and I will be fighting this. And so I don't believe that it was ever presented, either that or if it was, somebody had the common sense to stop that one. But this is stuff that we're dealing with when I was racing. So if the men in 1990 thought that we were really so compromised during our periods that we couldn't race, but it's okay to throw a transgender woman in there, that doesn't compromise us at all. I can't even believe we're even having this conversation.
I know, this is unbelievable. That's the Heinz Verbruggen, 1990s. Wow, that's just so late in the game to be so far. Although, when was he born, right? So he's probably an early boomer or something like that, still caught up in some of the old misogyny or just misunderstandings about female biology and so forth. So I'll give you an interesting story. In the 1990s, when I took over being race director of Race Across America, we had two women, Shauna Hogan and Muffy Ritz, who were really good. They were so strong. So in 93, Shauna led the entire field of men. There was like 28 men and I think maybe 4 or 5 women. And so Shauna and Muffy were way ahead of all the women. But Shauna led the entire field into Colorado. And so we're all driving along, thinking, "Oh my God, what if she won? This would be incredible. This would be so cool." And maybe maybe ultra marathon sports don't need sex divisions. Maybe because, women could win long distance races for whatever reason. The physiology doesn't matter. Or maybe they have greater pain control. I don't know, whatever. We just had these conversations, right? And, but by the finish line, Shauna was 25 hours behind the men's winner, which was Jerry Tatry, a professional road racer from Australia. Just did not have the same strength, even though she's phenomenal. And, the greatest long distance female cyclist ever. And so I remember after the race, I asked her and Muffy, I told both of them, we had these conversations during the race, and, just the thought I'd asked, would you just care to have no sex divisions at all in RAM? No, we like the sex divisions because it really isn't fair. It's just the physical differences are just too profound, even in a long distance event like that.
Yeah, the women's racing unto its own, and any of those competitions, I find that I far prefer them over the men. Like one of my favorite is just like tennis. I can't stand watching the men because it's just a power slam fest. I love the finesse of the women. You get into basketball, and I love the finesse of the men. Actually, I really love men's basketball as well with that. And I love watching football and to enjoy just the sheer power of a man. And yet I really enjoy women's sports and the finesse that these women have. And oh my God, let's look at soccer. I mean, women's soccer is just amazing. So to me, it's kind of like a sport by sport preference, but you can never compare the two hand in hand because they're just different. And I love the women's sports for what it is on its standalone for what it is. Who doesn't love watching the female body, an athletic woman at her peak perform? It's beautiful to watch, the same way that it is beautiful to watch a man at their physical peak perform. And yet they're completely independent of each other. And so I hate it when people say, well, the women's really boring or this or that. I'm like, no, if you just watched women's sports and stop comparing it to men's sports and just really watch women's sports and get invested into it, you will love it for what it is. I mean, and here's a great comparison. Well, if you really only want to watch the best, then why are you watching college? Or why are you watching high school? Because you're watching somebody at college early on in their career, and yes, they can be quite a bit better, but you're watching the beauty of them compete at where they are in their growth and development, or who they are. So you can't say, well, they're not the best out there, they're not as good as the pros. Well, of course they're not. They're still amateurs, they're still college. And then let's take it a step back from there. When you watch some of these little, kids leagues and stuff like that, you can sit there and go, wow, that was impressive for that kid, for that age, or for where they're at. And so this is where I wish that people would acknowledge women's sports for what it is and the beauty of it for what it is.
I think I agree with you on the shorter distances. Actually, I read an article recently, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, about the men's in professional tennis in the Grand Slams, where they have to go best 3 out of 5. They usually go 4 or 5. It usually goes on for 4 or 5 hours. And it's too long for the commercial aspects of it because they only have so many commercials they've sold. And viewers just get tired of seeing, the nth edition of that commercial over and over. And same thing in the Tour de France coverage. When they do the start to finish and it's a 5-hour stage, and you've seen, the Mr. Clean bottle ad for the 40th time. It's like, how effective can this be? Right. So that the advertisers are saying, shorten it up because, and also the owners or the race directors are like, well, we should have shorter so we can, sell more effective ads and then have a new race or a new tournament or round or whatever.
I honestly wish in the men's cycling Tour de France that they would start shortening the stages. I mean, they've really turned it into a march that's kind of gone over the top. And are you helping to facilitate doping at this point? Because you're taking these people beyond what I think that the body actually can do. And is it, God, this is a great discussion. Is this one of the things that has kind of pushed doping forward? Is because we're asking the body to do something that is just way too much?
Yeah.
That is a discussion within itself right there with doping.
Yeah, well, let's have that discussion. I mean, many professional sports are like that. The NFL players, those guys are all jacked up. How could they not be? They're constantly injured, constantly banging themselves up. And in professional cycling or any of those top end sports like that, you're doing this, for your whole life, all 6 hours a day or whatever, even in training. Yeah, the body's not designed to do that. It needs help. So you start with diet, nutrition, of course, then coffee and whatever other stimulants. And then it's really a spectrum of just ratcheting it up a little bit more. And then you get a game theoretic problem of what's called the other guy problem. Well, I don't want to dope, but the other guys are probably doing it. And even if they're not doing it, but everybody thinks they're doing it, right? Then you get this spiral of silence, this pluralistic ignorance where everybody thinks everybody else believes something or is doing something. And even if you don't, you think, well, I better. The famous study on this was binge drinking in colleges. That when they're interviewed alone, the students all said, "Oh, I don't like it. I don't want to do it." But they all said, "But everybody else is doing it, so I kind of got to go to these binge parties and drink, right?" And so then you get them all together and go, "Hey, guess what? None of you actually want to do this." Oh, okay, right. So so there's that problem. And I wrote an article for Scientific American on doping in sports and cycling in particular, and focused on the big transition that happened when Amgen invented EPO as a drug for cancer patients that were anemic. So it stimulates your bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. You know all this, but I'll just tell our listeners. And it was a huge breakthrough for cancer treatment for anemia. But of course, endurance athletes glommed onto this right away, like, oh, more red blood cells to my muscles. Well, great, right? And so you have a natural background rate of your hematocrit. That is, let's say 40 to 50% of your blood is red blood cells. The rest is other stuff. And so if you can increase that, say if you're at 40, get it to 45, get it to 50, maybe 55 would be even better. Maybe 60 would be better still. And then, of course, that was the, what's his name? The Dutch rider who won the Tour de France, I think in 96. He was called Mr. 60% because that's what he kept his hematocrit level at.
I can't remember his name, but I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And,
so, but let's say you're at 40 and, the other guys are going to be right up, even when the UCI sets the limit at 50, everybody's going to be right at 49.5% or whatever. And you sort of feel like you have to do it, even if you don't want to do it. So here you have a breakdown in the difference between the kind of governing body enforcement of the rules versus what's actually going on in the field. And that seems to be where the problem lies for not just cycling, but in any sport like that.
I can understand how doping happened, because I know I hit that turning point in my career where, what was it? So Longo is doping on her EPO, and it was Joe Papp that outed it. Yeah, and Joe Papp outed that, and I remember hating Joe Papp because he sold drugs, and then I really liked Joe Papp because he outed everybody. So I'm like, now I talk with Joe Papp, right? I went from hating this guy to like, he outed everybody. I mean, someone was going to sell drugs, and but I remember telling somebody, it's like, well, when we stand on the podium, she knows and I know that I'm clean. And started laughing. They're like, oh, no, she's just wondering, the program she's on is a lot better than the program you're on. I'm like, yeah, that probably is. They're just going to assume that you're doping. But one of the things that pushed me out was then I did like an extensive, blood panel, and realizing that every single organ that I had, major organ, was in some form of distress. And I'm operating naturally. What was the other term for it? Bread and water. But trying to take supplements, trying to have my diet as good as possible, do the blood work and everything.
Paniagua.
Yeah. And every organ that I have is in a state of distress. And I thought, this is just not healthy. It's just not healthy. We used to laugh about how we look like walking racks of antlers. Sack of antlers is what I used to call myself. You want to be as lean as possible, and you're not. I never got to the point that, like, I was the fattest cyclist out there, and at the same time I'm still a sack of antlers. And but what this does to your body, I couldn't comprehend that, and I had to walk away. I didn't have to. I walked away for health reasons because I didn't want to hurt my body. And looking at the level that I would have had to have trained to have kept up with Longo, with her EPO, it's like, I know what I can and I know what I can't do. And I knew that I could not train any harder. I could not do that. Maybe if I took EPO, but and I thought about that, and yet, and for me, it was never an option, because when I looked at my hematocrit level, I was always naturally around 46 to 47. And any more than that, then you're looking at health issues when you get to 50. So I'm already naturally there. And my heart rate, I was most efficient between about 190 to 195. And so maybe that's why I had the success that I had, because I had the genetic anomaly of I already had a high hematocrit level. And then think about if my heart rate, like a lot of people, their heart rates are, they blow at 150 or 160. And if my efficient operating rate is around 193 heart rate, think about how much more blood I am pumping through my system, how much more oxygen I'm getting through my system, because my heart rate runs it in the 190s, and I'm efficient there. So now you start getting into these little weird genetic things. Another one was, and this one I don't really understand very well, but it was my dad. He had cancer, and he stopped producing red blood cells, but he had a type of red blood cell that would carry more oxygen. And now I'm saying shit that I don't even know. But it's also my understanding that depending on the blood type, you can carry more. So he goes in there, and he has a hematocrit level of like 5 or 6, and he's just chatting away, talking to people. I'm just looking at him like, how are you functional if you have a 5 or 6 hematocrit level? And he just goes, well, now you know why you're a good cyclist, huh? I'm like, what? I mean, just over my, it wasn't years later until I understood that. So you start looking at, I don't even know where I'm going with this conversation, genetic anomalies within people, maybe because we're on the EPO topic here of, I don't know.
Well, I don't within each sex, of course, there's great variation. You could beat most men, but the average man could, the people in the above average of the male category could beat you. As Serena Williams always said, the 100th ranked male tennis player would beat me every time 6-love. I wouldn't even be able to get a game, right? So, and she's the greatest tennis player of all time. I saw on your webpage that you are supporting Rebecca Twigg, who's experiencing, I guess, some homelessness in Seattle. It's really a sad case, but I knew her back in the 80s. In fact, because I was a writer, a major publishing house approached me and said, we really want to do this women's cycling book, and we want Rebecca Twigg to be the author, and we've contracted with her, but all she does is race, and she can't get the book done. Can you write it? Just go over there and interview her, and just turn the tape recorder on, and then write it all down, and then we'll edit it. And like, okay. So I go over to her house a couple of times, and this is when she was married to Mark Whitehead. He was called Meathead at the time. And this was not a good environment for writing a book, for sure. But this was in like late 83, early 84, before the 84 Olympics, when blood doping was allowed. And the famous cycling coach, Eddie B, as he was called, they were all doing it. She was doing it. She told me she used, I think, a relative's blood or sister's blood or something like that. And then after the 84 Olympics, they banned it.
Was this, actually, you can answer a question for me. Was this a one-off time that she did this? Or was this...
that I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't really know. Yeah. I don't know. I just remember there was talk, that everybody was doing this, and then it was banned after the 84 Olympics, and who knows if they kept doing it or not secretly. But that's the problem, even if you just think other people are doing it. So back to my Scientific American article, for that I interviewed Frankie Andreo, one of Lance's teammates, who told me he did it, and he didn't want to do it, but everybody else was doing it. And he said that it wasn't just that I thought they were doing it. I know they were doing it because there were guys I used to beat regularly, or I could just stay up with them. And, you have these 4 or 5 hour stages. And one of his jobs as a domestique, those listening that don't know the jargon here, he's one of Lance's teammates. Lance is the star. Frankie's job, along with some of the other guys, is to go back to the team cars, which are, like a half a mile back, and then pick up water bottles, stuff them in your jersey, and along with food, and then get all the way back to the front. That's a hard job to do. That's like you got to pass hundreds of guys and so on. And he said he used to do that regularly, and then all of a sudden he's getting dropped on just rollers because the entire peloton is like 10% faster than it used to be. And basically he said, I just had to do it, or I'm back to whatever, working at McDonald's or something, right? Just can't even race your bike. So, and to take a controversial stand here and defend Lance a little bit, when Lance entered the sport, this was already rampant. Greg LeMond told me stories when he came back from his getting shot and then won the tour a third time. And then, his teammates all came to him. I think this was 1990, 1991, right when EPO was introduced. And the teammates are like, Greg, we got to get on the program. We're getting our asses kicked. Everybody is doing this thing. We got to do it. And Greg's like, we're not going to do it. And that was the end of his career. So someone like Lance comes along mid-90s, and, he's basically told, see that guy there, that guy, he's going to kick your ass. You know why? Because he's doing EPO. That's why. And so, Lance did what we now know he did. He goes to Michele Ferrari and says, all right, everybody's doing this. I want to do it professionally. And then we know the rest is history. So, okay, yes, he doped, right, and got caught and so on and so forth. But everybody he beat, every podium person for all 7 tours, they all doped. They all said they all got caught. They all did it. So here you have an ethic.
No, I agree with you on this. I understand how the doping happened. I have tried to never be critical of Lance because it's a systemic thing. Everybody's in there. He's just another one of the people in there doping. And this is the same thing that we ran into even in the women's, is that the doping became very prevalent. And I'm like, I'm out. There was a time that I could beat everybody, but once the drugs started, coming in, it was like, this is futile. It's either leave the sport and or take drugs. And the women was at that level. And so I decided to walk away. But I understand why people choose to stay and take drugs and to be there. I get that. And
even the, stripping Lance of his titles, okay, I can see why they did that. But, why have none of the other riders come through to say, well, then I should be given that yellow jersey? Well, because you were doping, that's what. And I don't know how far down you could take it to the 161st place guy gets the jersey or something, right? He's the only one that wasn't doped. Come on. So, and it's the hypocrisy of the inconsistency. Major League Baseball, when the Houston Astros cheated in the World Series against the Dodgers, Major League Baseball didn't take away their World Series title. Or the Barry Bonds, now there's an asterisk, but he did what
with the football that was inflated incorrectly.
Oh, yes. Right, inflation gate, right? Tom Brady, yeah.
Sadly, it's, and I guess good. People are competitive; they want to win, and some of us will win at all costs, and some of us are like, yeah, I'm out of here. And not going to put any judgment on it and just say it just is.
Well, in the Barry Bonds case, he said basically he saw what happened with Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa during the summer of the great home run derby. I mean, it was exciting. It was massive. It was huge. And then it came out they were doing steroids, the variations on steroids and growth hormone or whatever they were doing. So he said, well, okay, then I'm going to do it because Major League Baseball is not really enforcing any of this. They're kind of just sweeping it under the rug. So the hell with it. Look at the rewards that come. He wanted to be the big home run hero like McGwire and Sosa were. Anyway, so I could sort of see how it happens. If it's a kind of an arms race between the organizers and the athletes in a sport, the organizers have to stay on top of that or else the whole thing breaks down. If you just turn an eye to the whole thing like the NFL does. I was reading a story about, the NFL and Major League Baseball players are so strongly unionized that the doping testers have to set up a date 3 months in advance through the guy's agent. Okay, we're coming, October 17th at 3:00 to test your guy. Okay, we'll be ready. It's like, yeah, okay.
I loved it when they had out of competition testing because when I wasn't racing my bike, I was generally up in the mountains. Our family had a big roundup of cattle where we took them out of this huge 100,000 acre allotment up in the forest. It was like, yeah, you can find me. I'm about 50 miles up. Follow this dirt road here. We'll put up a sign for you, and that's where half of my out of competition testing happened. Was they had to go track me down in the mountains. And it was like, good luck with that. Can you come to town? No, can't come to town. You guys have to come to me.
Right. I have no idea what's going on now. If they're still doping in cycling or other sports, I assume probably, but I just don't know if the sport is sophisticated, if the drug testing has gotten sophisticated enough to prevent it.
I want to believe that it's been cleaned up. I really do, because at least within the women's peloton, from what I'm watching in there, like, you see a lot of consistency. Like when you watch Marianne Vos or Annemiek van Vleuten or Van der Breggen, they're consistent throughout the years. And to me, that's a big marker of not taking drugs, but also I want to say Longo is consistent too, but she took off time here and there where she disappeared. But you watch these others and they're so consistently there. And so I want to believe that they're clean, but I was also one of Lance's biggest cheerleaders when he was being what I considered, falsely accused. So when it comes to this, I'm generally off the mark. And I hope that the testing is better. It does seem like it's better. But I've also heard stuff like, they'll come up with a new drug and then WADA has to spend 10 years trying to figure out how to get a test for it. So I don't know. And then you watch. This is a whole other topic. But my new joke now is like the omerta, thou shalt not speak of doping. The omerta in cycling, I call it the new omerta is thou shalt not speak of gender doping and you shall be quiet. And or you'll get
right.
There's the exact same thing going on here. Is if you speak of gender doping, is what I like to call it, you will be canceled. You will be shamed. You will be, all the same thing that they did to any of the journalists or cyclists that tried to call out the rampant doping. We know what happened to them, and you can draw some pretty strong parallels between that and the gender doping, which is transgender women in women's sports. I mean, I'm sure, seen the smear campaign against me because I've become, within the women's sport of cycling, the most, I'm not going to say I'm the most outspoken. I just kind of, Allison Sidor and I have this joke. We have this kind of race back and forth about who gets the most followers and who can put something out there to get more followers. We got a race behind the race here. And so I always joke about, trying to get more coverage for women's sports, but somehow I think I beat out Allison on this one because I put out something controversial enough that the headlines kind of picked up on. I'm like, ha, gotcha, Allison.
Yeah, but as I said at the beginning here, that why does it take well, let's just say a conservative, like someone like on Fox News, to point this out, or a Megyn Kelly or a Jordan Peterson? Where are the liberals? How come CNN isn't all over this supporting you? And maybe it's an age thing. Maybe you're a second wave feminist, and we're baby boomers, and the Gen Xers or the Gen Zs are different now.
I have been a Democrat my whole life, and I have been left leaning my whole life, and this particular topic, men in women's spaces, I want to say that I've moved right, but I don't think that I have moved right. I've always been, socially liberal and fiscally conservative, and so I've always just kind of balanced there in the middle. But I feel like the left, I'm sitting here, and I feel like the left just really went left, and the right is kind of at the same place. And I have found myself somewhat politically homeless, and I've been criticized for being on Fox News and such. And I'm like, because nobody else will touch us. And this is how it's become political, and it shouldn't be a political discussion. This should be a human rights issue discussion for equality for women. It should be that type of discussion, but now it's become a right and a left. And if you actually talk to a lot of the left people, the Democrats, in this particular area, most of them agree with me with my stance, but they will vote party line, and which is kind of sad. And then you see it also with the media. If it isn't the right media covering it, the left refuses to touch it. But you'll see a lot of these women who are in the media are starting to leave that media because they don't agree with what's going on with the women's spaces. And so you're starting to see people in the left in the media starting to leave. One of the worst ones right now is if you specifically look at cycling media, you won't see a single article that is pro women on this topic. You will see all of these articles about pro women relative to racing and equality and prize money, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes to the transgender issue, all cycling media is pro transgender, but they try to say that they're pro women by we support equal prize money, equal coverage, stuff like that. So there's this one area of equality that they absolutely refuse to touch. The only cycling media that barely represented it is when Cycling News came out a couple of days ago on this issue relative to Marion Clinier and myself being booted off of Senesca, or both, or she was fired, but it was because she was speaking out about the transgender issue. I don't know how I slid under that one for so long, but then I left because I wanted to speak out more, and they still retaliated for my position, which is interesting because I came into the position of being on the board of directors. They knew my stance. They knew Marion's stance. And this is where there's a schism with this, because the man who bankrolls it and the general manager, Chris Gutowski, I mean, I have the emails talking about them supporting my position and still wanting me on Senesca, as was staff. And they brought in somebody non-binary or transgender as a mechanic. And somewhere in there, they decided that they were pro-transgender women in women's racing. And then they put out this public statement, which is more of a smear campaign towards me. But this is the lengths that the transgender advocates will go to silence people. Like, man, if we really smear Inga, this will really get her out of here. And all it did was empower me and get more coverage, for this cause. With Senesca, I find it interesting that they're advocating to promote women. And when they did this political statement, even though they're saying they're not getting into politics, they made this statement without consulting any of their riders. Well, how do you feel about this? And the majority of the riders on Senesca support my stance. And so here goes Senesca putting out this political statement on something that I have in writing that they agree with me on. So I'm still at a loss as to why they would make a statement about that. They're the only team that has ever made that type of statement. But back to where I find the irony is you have Marion Clinier on there, who multiple-time Olympian, multiple medals in world championships and Olympics. You have me as an Olympian, multiple medals. We're the only ones on Senesca that have international experience, that are Olympians. Multiple worlds, and Senesca stands for the first woman Olympian, ever to medal, and it was in the chariot racing. So you have two Olympians that actually have the international experience, and everybody else is, they've kind of dabbled in cycling. But Senesca removes the two experienced people that are the Olympians, and Senesca is an Olympian. I mean, the irony is just like over the top.
Inga, let's identify who we're talking about here just to clarify. So we have Chris Gutowski, general manager of Syneska, and Jeff Jones. He is what, the bankroller or the financier of the team?
Yeah, he's the man that finances it.
Okay.
And so this is his project to better women's sports.
Okay. Here's their statement. Let me read it and then you can respond. Just in case they're listening to this, here we go. To be clear, Ms. Thompson is entitled to her opinions and advocacy, but her methods and personal attacks are inconsistent with Syneska's mission to advance opportunities for women. These methods, well documented on Ms. Thompson's social media presence, include dehumanization of transgender people, spreading misinformation, demagoguery, and personal attacks on anyone who opposes her views. All right, if they're listening, what is your response?
Jeff Jones is a good guy. Jeff Jones supports my position. He has supported it from before I gave him on the team, and he supports my position on this. And Chris Gutowski, when I came onto the team, supported my position on this. One of the emails talks about they'd be breaking windows and rioting in the streets. So for Chris Gutowski to flip like this, and Chris Gutowski is the one who wrote this, Jeff Jones was not happy about Chris writing this. I had an agreement with Jeff Jones that as much as I appreciated Syneska's vision, I wanted to advocate more for women. And I wanted to step down from Syneska because I didn't want them to be associated with that. I've never tagged Syneska on anything. I've never brought them in, but I wanted to become louder with this, which I had Jeff Jones, blessing. And we talked about, why don't I just quietly step away from this? And did you read the resignation letter that I had, that I wanted to step away and to advocate more for women. So if my advocating for women is dehumanizing for transgender people, well, we've heard that argument before. Demagoguery, so for the politicalization of this, if you want to call it political, I call it a human rights issue. What was the other accusation?
Here, sorry, let me pull that back. Spreading information, demagoguery, personal attacks on anyone who opposes your views.
Okay, so personal attacks. I think I've made it very, very clear that, say, we'll use Austin Killips, legally has the right to be there. So if you go through my thing, my posts, I say again and again, Austin Killips legally has the right to be there. What I am challenging is the policy. So if I'm spreading misinformation...
Okay, just to be clear for listeners who forgot where we were on this, that was an hour and a half ago. That's the person, the male to female trans who entered and won the Tour of Gila in Arizona last month.
Correct. Yeah, transgender woman that won. And Austin Killips legally had the right to be there per the policy in place, set by the UCI. And I have never challenged that. What I'm challenging is the policy, because we now have 22 peer-reviewed scientific studies that show that it's not fair, even after 14 years. So I'm challenging the policy, that the policy, the rules and regulation, or that needs to be revisited with the new science that is out there. So if spreading misinformation is me putting out the new scientific study, they can call it misinformation. I call it, I'm posting scientific studies. So we're just going to have a difference of opinion on that one. So if we rehash all of this, it's not the demagoguery, it's not a political position. This is a human rights issue, equality for women issue. Misinformation, scientific journals, if you don't like them, you think it's misinformation, you're definitely sucked into the ideology. I think I've kind of covered that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Their accusations,
I
I think they've taken it and twisted it. Because
I wonder if the problem is what you said before of cancel culture. they, like everybody else, I've heard from quite a few people in the sport of professional cycling who agree with you, but they're afraid to speak out. They just don't know what to say. They want to keep their head down. I just want to ride my bike. I don't want to get involved in all this. Yeah, okay, well, but you can't have everything, right? So I often think of this as a kind of a conflicting rights issue, like in the abortion issue. You have conflicting rights between the rights of the woman to choose, the rights of the fetus to live. You can't have everything. These are hard choices. That's a particularly hard one. I'm pro-choice, but I understand pro-life arguments. Okay, but Thomas Sowell always says you can't have. But what does he say? That there is no utopia. There's just compromises. There's no perfect solutions. Just compromises. And so I support trans rights. I don't think trans people should be discriminated against at work or not being given real estate mortgages or car loans or fired from their job or anything like that because they're trans. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But if you want to enter a women's sports and you're a man, well, sorry, that you can't have everything. You just have to give up something. We have to make those hard. So real politics is making compromises, and that's just the way it goes. And the problem here, though, if you pick the wrong side in the ideological culture wars, there are consequences to pay. Cancel culture is real, and even though most polls show less than 10% of Americans think that, for example, a male to female trans athlete can be in a women's division. So the vast majority of people agree this is just wrong. It's obvious it's wrong, but they're afraid to say anything. So you could have, I think it was like 7.5% who accept this. But that tiny minority, back to what I mentioned earlier about a pluralistic ignorance or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else thinks something, and so they're afraid to say anything. So the omerta rule works when people can't communicate. So what would you say to people listening that, I want to say something, but I don't want to get in trouble at work, or I don't want to, get involved in politics, or, that you need to speak out because, it's a minority position. And until everybody knows it's a minority position by enough of us speaking out, then this will stop.
Yeah. If people would speak up, all of this would stop. It really would. And this is an awful analogy that I'm going to use, but like when you look at the Nazis and Hitler, the fear that people had of speaking up is very, very real. And there's a woman in our town who lived in Germany when this was happening, and everybody was against this. The vast majority was against this. And she talked about this as being a young girl from the age of about 10 to 18 and how they starved. They were starving. And the German people were starving because everything went into the war, and the German people, the vast majority were against this, but they were scared to speak up because they too, she talks about, would get, if you didn't line up, you would get shipped out. And there's a comparison here that I see of fear of people wanting to protect themselves. It's real. I mean, I have watched so many women lose their jobs, get shamed, it's horrifying to watch it. I can't tell you how many, this isn't the first board that I've been kicked off, and it's not through this last 5 years, it's been a brutal journey. But you can't fire me. I'm on a cattle ranch. I'm sure the cows would love to fire me and get me out of there, but you can't get rid of me. They had for the longest time effectively silenced me within the cycling community. We laugh about that. I had somebody had sent me a whole bunch of private screenshots of this group, and they talk about silencing, and they talked about doing the turf tracker and then they had taken all these people's names that had liked my post about the letter sent to the International Olympic Committee, and they systematically went through this list, and they started targeting all of these people and then bragged about, oh yeah, we're getting all of the likes are disappearing off of this. And these groups will find anybody that would agree with me and then went after all of their jobs. The campaign is stunning to watch, stunningly effective to watch. How do you beat that? You have to get brave. You just have to get brave. And we're starting to see that. And this one is, it should be an easy one because it's sports. You have all of 22 scientific studies, and yet people are still scared. And I get that. I mean, they watch just what happened to me. That ought to make them even more scared. But at the same time, what I'm finding is anytime anything gets pushed to a level to a certain point, you also get people mad. And this is what I'm finding about Siniska's attempt to completely smear me has backfired, because I have gotten more letters of support and more people saying, we will go to this protest in Knoxville, Tennessee, and wear a woman's t-shirt. So the tactic that has always worked, I think Siniska took it too far with their smear campaign, and it backfired. Or at least that's the way that I'm reading it right now. But I've been wrong on a lot of things. But I have had more people reaching out going, we will get you stickers, we will get you wristbands, we will go there, we will. So they may not exactly go to Knoxville, Tennessee, but I'm hoping that this is part of me. Is like one of the podiums, a transgender woman was there and beat, I think, like 20 odd women, but none of the women showed up for the podium ceremony. That's a pretty quiet way of protesting. I'm like, that was kind of good. Don't give up your opportunity to race. Never give up your opportunity to race, but you can not turn up on the podium and, pay whatever fine it is for not turning up on the podium. There's a lot of ways to get it out there without being too loud. And I'm trying to advocate for a peaceful protest, a quiet protest. Just wear a t-shirt that says woman. I mean, if that's political to call yourself a woman, I call it biology.
I know Megyn Kelly's been wearing this hat. I forget what it says, like, make women real again or something like that. It's like, why Megyn Kelly? Why the conservatives? Why the Fox News? I just want to scream at liberals. You're handing this over to conservatives. It's now their, like the free speech thing. Now, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity are defending free speech. What? How come I'm not listening? How am I not hearing that on CNN? What has happened here? It's crazy.
Again and again, I've heard people, and I'm one of those, I've been a lifelong Democrat and I will be voting Republican. And I can't tell you how many women I have talked to that have said, because of this one issue, they will vote Republican because of this issue. So as the Democrats are shoving this down our throats, they are alienating their base.
Right.
They just took it too far. Biden, with Title IX, has taken it too far. I mean, yes, we should have acceptance of transgender people, but then you get a whole new level of rage when it gets shoved down your throat.
Yeah. Would it be too much to ask these women to just not compete? Like if Leah Thomas shows up there on the starting blocks, they all just step off and walk away? Is that can't happen because that's the end of your career?
I want women to compete. I don't want women to start walking away, because then the transgender advocates are like, good, we don't want you here anyway. All transphobes should leave the sport. Never ever walk away from your sport. But you could do something like that. You continue to train, but as soon as there's a transgender woman there, you can step away. I never ever want to target a transgender athlete. I don't think that that's right. You have to go after policy, but it's not working to go after policy, because we have spent 5 years. I've put together, several of us have put together the Union Cyclist Femme, and we brought in specialists in sports physiology in this area, and we presented it to the UCI, and crickets, nothing. Get back like, well, you have to put it through CPA Women, which is Cycling Professional Association for the Women. Put it through them, crickets, nothing. And the general attitude is, ignore them, it'll blow over. Ignore them, it'll blow over. Oh, there was a big outrage about Austin Phillips. Ignore it, it'll blow over. And that is the tactic of ignore it and it'll blow over, which is exactly what they have done to us for the last 5 years, trying to get a seat at the table just to be listened to, and they just ignore. That is the tactic. And so after Austin Killips won, 2 days later, the UCI said, we stand by our transgender policy. And then Inga gets loud and says, take a knee, where we are going to protest. 2 days later, I want to take credit for this. I don't know if this is actually true or not. Here comes the UCI go, we're going to relook at that policy and we're going to talk to female athletes. And by this point, I'm like, do you really think that's going to make me withdraw the protest? No, that's just another form of like, we're going to kick the can down the road. As soon as that happens, they're not going to revisit the policy. And to date, what was that, a couple of weeks ago? To my knowledge, no women athletes have been invited to the discussion. Who is always invited to the discussion are transgender women. But women athletes are not invited to the discussion. And if they are, it's ignored. Like we did a survey of the professional women cyclists. 93% said that they did not want transgender women in their sport. We submitted this to the UCI. That was ignored too. So you have tens of thousands of signatures and letters and a survey of 93% of the women want their sport, and it is all ignored. So there does hit a certain point where you do have to start potentially on the starting line. If there's a transgender woman there, I feel sorry for that transgender woman, but you stand there and you don't participate and let them compete on my own. In the past, I have always said, no, you never target the athlete. But given the mass blatant ghosting of the women in anything, it might have to get to that point. I said, I don't want to single out the athlete, but how else? Between protesting and that, what is it going to take to get heard? And, and then there's a whole other dynamic going on here at Cross Country Nationals. Did you follow this in Connecticut? Cross Country Nationals? So there was this fear that there was going to be a protest again like there had been the year before. And the year before, 5 women wore Santa hats, and they weren't even cyclists, right? They weren't even cyclists. They didn't even know who Austin Killips was. And they had a sign that said, Save Women's Sports. And they stood in front of the cameras that they knew that the camera would be focused on the first place woman coming through. And they said, when first place woman comes through, hold up the sign in front of the camera, Save Women's Sports, put the sign down, because you never ever want to single out an athlete. That's all they ever did. They just stood in front of where the camera would be. First place woman came through. They held up the sign, Save Women's Sports. 5 of them in a Santa hat. Quiet. And all of the outrage of the harassment of the transgender athletes because 5 women were in Santa hats with a Save Women's Sports sign. They were harassing. There is zero documentation of this. I know the person that put this together. So the next year, here comes Cyclocross Nationals, and they are going to silence those women. And they bring in, I shit you not, 3 Antifa gun clubs, the John Brown gun clubs. And these John Brown gun clubs on social media are bragging about, we have radios and more to protect the transgender athletes. And Adam Meyerson, who is on the cyclocross commission at USA Cycling, is the head of this. These people greet him. They know each other. They bring in gun clubs. And USA Cycling says nothing. There is still no statement that they condemn Antifa gun clubs being there. And they're run around with, turfs go home and these, we hate turfs, and bragging on social media about having guns that are undercover, And I'm like, 5 women hold up a sign and they are smeared all over cycling media, but 3 gun clubs come and there's no mention of it whatsoever. But this is okay.
Unbelievable.
The intimidation of what they will do to intimidate a woman is over the top. And just when I thought you can't get any worse than that, than bring in gun clubs to intimidate any women. And oh, by the way, they asked me, is there is there a protest going on there? I'm like, I have checked every source that I have. I'm deeply connected into this. There is no protest, right? But they still bring in the gun clubs anyway. So now that we're announcing a protest, what's going to happen? I mean, they've already done a great smear campaign with me with Siniska. Hey, still here. I mean, now they're going to bring in more gun clubs to silence people? It's like, and all of this, it would be so easy for it to stop. The UCI needs to come in and stop this policy and make it just women only. And this is the way that it should work. It shouldn't be they put transgender women into the women's sports and then say, hey, women, you need to prove that this isn't fair. That never should have happened. It should be the transgender athlete should be proving that it's fair before they allow them into women's sports. This thing it's bass backwards. They should be proving it's fair. And they have not proved
it's the burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof? It's the person with the unusual claim that's challenging the mainstream. They have the burden of proof. Yeah, I remember when Martina Navratilova first spoke out about this, about the trans women in women's sports. She got mobbed. I mean, it was ugly on Twitter. And then she backed off initially, and she issued this horrible, groveling apology. I will go away and read and learn and rethink this through. And then finally she realized this was bullshit, and now she has found her voice. But of course, people like you and her are uncancelable, like J.K. Rowling. She can't be canceled. She's the richest woman in history, right? But look what happens to them despite all the barricades they have. I mean, J.K. Rowling has to have personal security because, she gets credible death threats and so on. So, yeah, I think we do have to be sympathetic. What if you're a 19-year-old athlete and you're just trying to make it, and you haven't done anything yet, and you're trying to get sponsorship or get on a team or whatever? The incentive to keep your mouth shut is pretty strong.
You cannot ask the athletes to take a stand. I mean, at least that's my perspective. But we can ask the team owners to protect their athletes, and we can ask the parents to step in there and the coaches to step in. But to ask the athletes, these are young women, and they're not, I think at this point, old enough to really get into something that like this that is so ugly. I personally think it's too much. At a younger age, I never could have handled what I go through now, and not to take away from them, because out of this I have met on amazing, strong young girls that have as much conviction as I do, but they want to race their bike. And I completely respect that. And that's where I'm like, I don't want the athletes to step up. I mean, unless they want to, but I don't think they should. I think that this is the team owners. This is a fight for the older women that have stood on the shoulders of the women before us. The reason why I have the right to sex segregated sports was because of the women that fought for my rights. And the reason why I have the right to vote is for the women that fought for my rights. But all of those women, got harassed, got thrown in jail. I mean, there were protests for a reason to get those rights. And that's where I am now. But I am here because of the women before me. I stand on their shoulders. And it's the older women that do this. So you see, you're like canceled, like, oh, you're old and retired, you shouldn't be speaking up. No, I am, because I am now at the prime of my life where I have the power and the knowledge and the credentials behind me that I feel like I'm making some very thoughtful choices here where, like I said, when I first stepped into this, I was all pro transgender women being in women's sports because the science that I had read at the time said that it was fair. And I support transgender people, but the more that the science came out, the more I was like, hey, this really isn't fair. And I am for also equality of women. And you can be pro-transgender and you can be pro-women. It doesn't have to be so viciously divided. And so through this process, I got to know transgender people, and and I have a lot of transgender. There's a couple places I don't want to go because I don't want to out anybody, but I really dove deep into the careness and the compassion and everything that goes into what happens to transgender people and what a difficult journey it is, and really wanted to understand. And I think I have more kindness and more caring and more compassion than I've ever had. And yet at the same time, I also have just as much kindness and compassion towards these young girls and everything that a young woman goes through. And she too needs her space. And there has to be a way to have room for both, but not at the expense of these young girls and their challenges. And
yeah, that's perfectly said. I have Deidre McCloskey coming on the show in a week or two. She is a male to female trans. She's one of the world-class economists, University of Chicago, publications and so on. And she wrote a memoir about her transition. It's an awful, painful story. I mean, she just could not live as a man anymore. And, it was a private affair, but then, she lost her family. They refused to speak to her anymore. Her children wouldn't speak to her anymore. They lost their dad, I guess they feel, or whatever. And so she wrote a memoir about this. It's heartbreaking to read this. And, she's a very successful economist and author, but the turmoil of doing this, she's not trying to get anything from it. She's just trying to live a life that is just whatever. I don't have that issue. It's hard to sympathize. I mean, it's hard to understand, empathize, but I can sympathize with it. And then I got, in response to one of my articles on this, a 5,000 word letter from a guy. Maybe he's slightly younger than me, but it's a female to male trans. So he now is married and lives the life of a male, and it would be, he says, hard to tell. And anyway, he doesn't want to come on the show, and so I asked, can I read your letter on the show at some point and just comment on it? Yes, you can, but please, I don't want anybody. They're not trying to cause trouble for anybody. They don't want even anybody to know, right? So there is that whole cohort of people that we need to be sympathetic to.
The ones that I personally know, that I have deep friendships with, I see a huge correlation between, and you also see this in some of the scientific journals, of Asperger's to autism to divorced families, a lot of sexual assault when they were younger. These are people that struggle. They really, really struggle. And their stories are just heartbreaking. And yet at the same time, the young girls that also have super, super traumatic lives and everything they've gone through, they too need to be honored. Like, when I was in cross country running in high school, the sport, we were just like this little misfit group of women, but the sports saved those girls. And those sports should be reserved for those girls that go through equally traumatizing divorces and rapes and family dysfunctions, and the sports is also good for those girls. And I think with the transgender athletes, if you have a category for them and honor them for who they are, I'm just saying that women shouldn't cease to exist, and their opportunities shouldn't cease to exist. We can support transgender people and support women, but you can't throw them into the same category. They need to be acknowledged independently and on their own. And we've kind of already gone down this one, but just when you start looking at the traumatic backgrounds that can be part of this, yeah, it needs to be honored, but it doesn't mean that we throw away the women in the meantime. And that's really what I'm advocating for, is the safe spaces for everybody.
Perfectly said, Inga. Okay, I think we've covered all the major trans issues here for now anyway. Hopefully things will change. But while I've got you, let's finish up with just a broader question on how to be a successful person, how to be the best in your sport or your field. A 14-year-old comes to you or writes you, or 15 or a 20-year-old says, I want to be like you. I want to be a champion, whether it's cycling or tennis, or they want to be a CEO, they want to be a senator, a congressman. A young lady comes to you and says, what do I do?
Boy, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Be willing, I call it willing to walk the gauntlet, that success comes slowly with perseverance. And the more that you get criticized, probably the more that you realize that you're starting to succeed. When you have people starting to attack you, there is that ever so delicate balance between, do I need to listen to this and to change the way that I'm doing something, versus is somebody trying to hold me down? And we have the crab pot theory. I've run into all of it. And you have to hold your truth. If you have a dream, hold on to that dream, because no dream just like merrily happens. It is a trial to get there. I think one of my favorite ones was like watching what Michael Jordan went through. All of the different teams that he got kicked off of because he wasn't good enough, and the people that are telling him he wasn't good enough. I know in my career, I've been told again and again and again that I can't, because one of my favorite was a close family member who basically said, well, I what's the backstory on this one? Just got into cycling. I hadn't been cycling for like a year. I got really, really sick. It took me out for about a year. Got back in there, and I'm about top 10 in the world. I remember them saying, you just don't really have what it takes. You just keep getting second. I'm like, I've only been at the international level for 3 years. What do you mean you're disappointed that I'm only getting second? It's like, when I was like, yeah, we kind of use you as an example of somebody who's kind of failed. I'm like, what? So it's like the better that you get, anticipate people really kind of trying to take you out at the knees. And then you start finding who are your friends and who are the people that crab pot want to drag you back down. But always be nice, always be kind, always take the high road, and always hold your truth.
Of like having a mentor, and also talk about like the practical aspects, the 10,000 hour rule. You got to put your 10,000 hours of training, practice, education, whatever it is, doctor, lawyer, politician, professional athlete. Maybe remind young people what kind of a commitment it really takes and who you should get on board, what kind of coach or mentor or somebody to help.
I had the incredible fortune. I had one gift, and it was a coach that I had. And he started coaching me in 6th grade. I started off in 5th grade and had a nasty coach that was verbally abusive, and I quit the sport. And that was 5th grade. In 6th grade, it was like, okay, new coach, I'll try again. And this guy was brutal in the sense of he drug us through the mud. He drug us through the snow. And he did it with a smile on his face and laughter. And he's like, come on, girls. And there'd be a snowstorm, and he took us through the mud, and he was laughing the whole way. And it developed this team camaraderie that, still exists to this day. But so starting at about the age of 6th grade, I didn't miss any workouts. And then that went on to, I would ride a bike to school, and then we would train in cross country, and then I would train in the mornings. And I did that all through high school, like double days. And I'm not as neurotic. I called myself the least neurotic of the neurotic people in cycling. But it was dedication to training, but also, intense hours and willing to train to the point that you're puking. I can't tell you how many times I puked, like this coach that I had in junior high school, and his name is Lyle Freeman. So I had him from 6th grade all the way through high school. And I would get so nervous at the races. And every single time I saw him on the course, and he was so nice, I would puke right in front of him. I think for like 6 years, I puked in the middle of every single race because of the nerves. And finally got over the nerves to the point that I was probably a little too casual about it. But that man in that 6 years gave me the confidence, gave me training regimes and how to develop that feel of how to know your body, and just as importantly, when to back off so that you don't overtrain. And so I kind of learned this balance of less is more. As a woman, I couldn't put in the miles that a man did. That fried me at one point and sidelined me, where I got really sick and developed a brain abscess, and I had the complications of chronic fatigue on top of that. And so the brain abscess really set me back. And so the rest of my career, I had to be very careful with my training because of, the chronic fatigue that kind of wanted to follow me. But yeah, the intensity of the training, I don't even know where to start with that.
So the general message here is you got to put in the hours.
Oh yeah, serious hours, and be willing to just suffer, and be willing to cry, willing to puke, and I call them all the badges of honor. and at the same time, you got to go there with grace, and you have to go there with style, and you can't be super cocky about it. Nobody likes that. It's not going to get you anywhere. One of my other models was my father. He, a man that never spoke of his accomplishments. And it wasn't until I was on the second Olympic team that I found out through somebody else that he had been on the long team for the Olympic ski team in 1956. And I remember we had to go to Seoul, Korea. And he was like, "Oh, I don't know about going to Seoul," because he had been in the war there in Korea. And then somebody said, "Yeah, he's got a lot of anxiety about that. He actually didn't make the team because of Seoul, Korea." And I'm like, "What? Make what team?" And then I find out about the 56 Olympic ski team, but he had back injuries from an airplane that he was in had gone down, and he had back injuries. It was the back injuries that kept him from whatever, but from being able to go to the Olympics. And it was just this beautiful, beautiful, my dad having memories of Korea, black and white, and the war and injuries, and this injury that kept him from attaining his goals. And then he gets to go there with me. And then the next wonderful moment of this was finding out that my race course was on the DMZ zone, which was the same area that he had, that their airplane had gone down. But he got to be there with his daughter in this same area where his crash had originally happened. And this is a man that, what an accomplished man that you never hear anything about. He grew up on the ranch that I'm on now, dirt poor. They had an outhouse. They did have cold running water, no electricity. And he put himself through medical school, working multiple jobs, and gets into Stanford University and is able to ski off of the GI Bill at Stanford University. Eventually goes on to become an orthopedic surgeon. But talk about a man that pulled himself up out by his bootstraps with nothing, through hard work and through dedication. You can make something of yourself. And no, he didn't make an Olympic team. No, he's not the wealthiest person in the world. He actually died quite poor because he spent all of his time, on money on airplanes. And then he would fly around to Indian reservations helping people. And but talk about the humility with the incredible dedication and accomplishments. And to me, he was my idol, is to speak softly, train the fuck out of yourself,
That's great. What a great story. Oh my God, Inga. I didn't know most of this about you. That's amazing. Yeah, I remember back in 1979, I got a job at Bicycle Dealer Showcase, the trade magazine for bike shops, because I couldn't get a job otherwise after I graduated with my master's degree in experimental psych. And I went over to the job placement office, and they said, "Well, what skills do you have?" I said, "None. I'm a student, but I can write. I like to write." And so they looked under editors or whatever, and there was a job for an editor at this bicycle dealer. So anyway, I got the job there, and I'm working there, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, pretty kind of typical boring job. And then I met John Marino, who was one of the co-founders of Race Across America. But before that, he was just a long distance cyclist. And before that, he was a semi-pro baseball player, right? So we became friends, and he would periodically come by the office during the day, during the week in his bike gear. And he's like, "I'm on a 6-hour ride. Let's have lunch." I'm like, "Man, what am I doing sitting in this office? I want to be that guy." So I got to know John. I said, "What do I got to do? What do I have to do? I want to do what you're doing." Right. Anyway, so I ended up doing something like that. And then I got to know John Howard, and I thought, how is this guy so good? Of course, John. How is he so good? What does he eat? How many hours does he train? Hard, slow, this fast, and what kind of clothes do you wear? How much sleep do you get? You just don't know any of this. So I just kind of followed him around. I'm just going to do what that guy does, right? Now, he has more natural talent than I do. But in any case, that's to me the role of not just a mentor, but also kind of a role model or other people that are doing what you're doing. And I'm going to do that. That has to play a big role too, I think.
Yeah, I followed the role model of my coach, Lyle Freeman, through junior high school and high school. The man was an amazing man. He was so dedicated. His only problem is that he got born in the wrong body. He was a very slight man of about 5'6", but the determination and will of a crocodile, an elephant, a lion, I don't know what it is, and he trained us. And then he went on to do the very first Extreme Games, X Games, the very first time that it came out in, I want to say around 82, 83, where they go across a river and they scale all of these mountains and stuff. And he maybe 100 pounds, 5'6", 5'7", somewhere in there. But the determination of this man, like we were counting the other day that he's broken like 60 bones and has had like 30 surgeries because of all of these extreme sports that he does. And he just had this smile like, "Oh yeah, I'll heal up from this," and he'd heal up and he'd get back into his extreme sports again, laughing and smiling the whole way. I mean, this man needs a story written about him, about the perseverance of his training and never backing down and breaking all of these bones, and he is still there, and his diet's impeccable, and he wonderful role model. And I wish more athletes had the example of Lyle Freeman and his dedication to training. Even if he didn't have the best body in the world for it, his heart and soul is there, and that's the most important thing ever. Is like I'll say, it's really not about winning. I mean, it is. You want that opportunity to win, but it's becoming the very best that you can be, knowing that you have a fair chance. And to me, this man influenced the lives of so many young athletes to be healthy, to train, and we do. We need that. We need that mentor for us, especially at those young ages. And this is where our school teachers and our PE teachers, just all school teachers, are so important for our youth. And anyway, I owe my career.
No.
Yeah.
I think most successful people, they have similar stories. I had a good mentor, teacher, role model, whatever. I remember when I wanted to get into writing books, and I got to know Stephen Jay Gould, the great essayist and author. And I said, "I want to do what you like with Marino. I want to do what you're doing. How do I do that?" He's okay. Here's what you got to do. You got to get an agent and a publisher. And this is okay. Yeah. All right, I could just end it there, Inga, and that's fine. But since it was several stories mentioned your breast cancer and your double mastectomy, I wonder if you want to make a comment first to young girls, teenage girls that are getting the so-called top surgery, just exactly what they're contemplating doing, and or to just women in their 50s, 40s, 50s, whatever, who may have to face this. What is this like? How did you deal with this, and what
Yeah,
message might you have for that?
I'm just a few months out from that. Boy, cancer, that's a journey that turns you upside down and inside out. My discouragement with the medical community is that I've heard too many stories of women wanting to have a preventative mammogram, and the doctors telling you, there's no risk of cancer in your family. You really don't have to do that. And in my family, there was no risk of cancer, no. But I went in anyway. I don't think I'd had an exam in like 7 or 8 years or something like that. I just kind of went in on intuition, and I was horrified to find that they had found this spot. Granted, it was very, very little. But here's the other thing that kind of horrifies me with the medical community is that they have what's called a standard of care. So if you have something really small, like mine had or was, and it was not in the lymph nodes, standard of care recommendation was, well, we'll do a lumpectomy and radiation and maybe chemo and drugs, and we'll watch this. And well, I was looking at the type of cancer that I had that is super, super hard to detect because it's lobular. It doesn't form a tumor. It spreads out in, it striates. It spreads out into little lines. And so it can be teeny tiny, but it can get into the lymph nodes, and it's really hard to detect. I'm like, why would I want to monitor something that only 10% of them get picked up at my level? They wait until they're like stage 4 before they get picked up because they're not a lump. Why would I want to sit around and wait? Well, that's what the drugs are for. That's what the chemo is for. And I'm thinking, well, why not a double mastectomy? And then that way I don't have this cloud of watching and waiting while putting me on radiation and drugs, when there really is a solution here that is the safest possible, which is a double mastectomy, but everything is about save the breast. I'm like, hold on, everything is about save the breast and do a lumpectomy and drugs and radiation, but you're also promoting with young women to remove the breast. And so I kind of had to, fight to have breasts removed when they're quote unquote slightly cancer, where the other breast wasn't good, but there's cancer there, but we're just going to do a lumpectomy and monitor it. It made me realize this is about there's a strong correlation here about this is about the money. We'll do a lumpectomy, and if that doesn't work, well, maybe another lumpectomy, and then we're going to do radiation and maybe chemo, but definitely drugs. And the what happens is then you have this body, like a woman's body is meant to have estrogen in the body. So if they put you on anti-estrogen aromatase inhibitor drugs, then they're called aging, where when you read stories about this, it's not as simple as taking drugs. The side effects are devastating. But this is the standard of care when there's a healthier option out there for somebody like me that's not in the lymph nodes, and that's to have a double mastectomy. So it's made me really take a step back and look at the medical community and go standard of care versus what is actually best for you. And then I started kind of seeing these correlations with the medical community wanting to sterilize and give drugs to children as the standard of care versus maybe we should not be giving these children drugs. I mean, it is, and these surgeries, is this like a self-fulfilling way to keep the medical? I mean, you just open up a can of worms there that I don't even know where to start. As far as what was really best for me, I had to fight for, which is a double mastectomy. And yet we're giving double mastectomies out to young girls that have gender dysphoria. Never in my life did I think that when I started this journey 5 years ago, that I would be dealing with the exact same issues of mastectomy and the drugs that these children would be taking and what this is going to do to your body, that I'd be facing the exact same things that I'm advocating for the protection of women for. So when it comes to the drugs that that people are taking, I've had already done a lot of research into it, which really, 5 years previously, which really helped me come to the decision of, I'm not walking that road of the drugs and what it does to your body, and going for the double mastectomy because I wanted to be healthy. And the people that willingly do this, there's a lot of women that have to take the drugs because their cancer is metastasized, and they have no other options. But there's a lot of disconnects here in our medical community that are being promoted that I hope one day will be addressed.
Interesting, the financial aspects of that. I hadn't really thought about that. Or just the medical concept of watchful waiting. In your case, it's not no negative consequences to just watchful waiting because you have to do the drugs and surgery and so on, which all have risks themselves. I would apply that watchful waiting to the gender dysphoria just in case turns out you're not actually in the wrong body, but that you're just going through puberty or whatever, something like that. Do you happen to know, there's this idea of like, we're just going to hit the pause button on puberty, do the puberty blockers for a while. You can always change your mind later and come back. The latest I've read on that is we don't know that you can do that, and maybe we know that you shouldn't do that.
You can't do that. That is a lie that you can pause puberty, and if you change your mind, take those drugs and puberty will happen. That is a lie that's being told to the parents and the children. You can't, when you start giving those kids those drugs, puberty is forever paused. And what happens in there is at the age that they give this, as you grow and mature, your brain matures, your bones mature. This is when you have the laying down of the bone. And so they're finding with these children that massive amount of broken bones, the maturation of the brain, that gets halted. I mean, we know that the brain matures up until the age of 27, 25, 27, somewhere in there. And the pituitary, I cannot pronounce it right now, it stunts all of these things. And so there was a gal that I know that her son went through precocious puberty, and they put him on these what would have been at the time, I think, Lupron, and then she has like a lifelong chore of, now this man is in his 30s and has a tough time making decisions and doing things. They call it the gateway drug. Once they get, if you let a child, all the studies are showing that if you let a child work through this, but not, no surgeries, no sterilization, no drugs, that most of them, 90% of them, turn out to just be healthy gay people. And now you don't have a lifelong patient. There's I'm trying to remember which author goes on this, but if you do the gateway drugs, you get them on the drugs at an early age, you now have a potential, it was something huge, don't quote me on this number, but like an $8 million patient that through that lifetime, they would be on those drugs throughout their lifetime. And so that it was a big push by big pharma. I've read a few reports about that. After what I went through with breast cancer, I was more likely to believe that because I got fast-tracked onto, you got breast cancer, lumpectomy, radiation, potentially chemo, and these drugs for the rest of your life. And I was just put on, and I'm like, whoa, hold on here just a second. Don't I get a say in this? This is that's standard of care. That's what we do. And anything that I wanted to deviate from that was like, suddenly I was the problematic patient. And so it kind of makes you wonder with these kids, that same thing, I call it running them down the conveyor belt of a little bit of gender dysphoria, let's get you on drugs and get you going, and then you're forever a patient. There's a reason that Sweden and Finland have suspended all of that now, and they just do the watchful waiting. And 90% of these children turn out to be gay. And the other, what was the other statistic that, there was only a few young children, women, young girls that were transgender, and then within a couple of years you had like a 4,000% increase. Well, now you can start labeling social contagion, or what was the other favorite one that I heard, that it was like having a transgender child is like having the new Gucci handbag. Look at me, I've got a transgender child. You see some of that as well, and not to take away anything from the parents that do have true transgender children, and I hurt for the parents that this is happening to their children.
Oh yeah, there was that tweet the other day by the actress Marcia Gay Harden, I think is her last name. Anyway, she tweeted like all three of her kids or something. Nobody is just a straight cisgender child. It's like, first of all, why do we have to know this on Twitter, right? Why is this being broadcast? And second, are you sure? Because the social contagion hypothesis is, gaining more and more support, mainly because the counterfactual, right? If it was just society is more tolerant and liberal, so more coming out, then you would see it in the older age cohorts, like age 20 to 25, 25 to 30, 30 to 35. And we're not seeing that happen in any of the other age cohorts, just the teenage age cohort.
Yeah. But the last that I've been following is a lot of these teenagers now too are also openly mocking it. And so we might see this shift in the trend that it's not the cool thing anymore. Like, remember when we were growing up, there was the pothead crowd, and then there was the goth crowd, and then there was the Farrah Fawcett hair crowd, and every generation goes through its evolution, and then it's not cool anymore. And we're already starting to see the road signs of being trans isn't cool anymore. It's gone from they're the most marginalized crowd to now the kids are kind of making fun of it and it's not cool. So I wouldn't be half surprised if we start seeing far fewer kids transitioning because it's not the cool. It'll be the next cool thing. I don't know what that is.
Well, yeah. Okay. I haven't heard that. That's great. That's great news. Yeah. It'll be interesting. We'll see a curve, like a 10-year span where there's a big spike and then, well, where'd they all go? Well, they never existed in the first place.
It's not cool anymore. Well, I was listening to, I can't remember who it was, but great investor, and he said that he watches the children and the teenagers, and then he can predict the trend in the next 10 years of where to invest. And so he could get like way ahead of the curve. And so I'm kind of applying that to, with a lot of the kids now, they're openly going, yeah, that's just not cool. A couple of kids say that's just not cool, and there goes that trend. And that's what I'm hoping happens.
Let's hope. We'll have you on again in a few more years, and we'll see where it lies there. Inga, that was great. This was way deeper, thoughtful, more interesting than I could have imagined, and I imagine it would go well. So thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for your public service. I hope this leads to more shows for you.